Okay, welcome everyone to the reconvening of hearing 19, Natural Features and Landscapes. We'll start today's session with, we've got two submitters up first of all. The first one is via Zoom, and then we have the second one, and then we're going to open hearing 19 and hear from some submitters who are joint submitters to both 19 and 20. But to kick things off, we'll start with Chorus New Zealand, Spark New Zealand Trading and Vodafone. And I understand we've got Chris Horn and Graham McCarrison online for Zoom call. So welcome, gentlemen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I can hear you fine.
Sorry. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for providing your statement of evidence, Mr. Horn. We've read that. It's very succinct and well set out. So thank you for that. Just before you start, I'll just ask whether you've had a chance to review the officer's response to panel's questions. Are you aware of that? We prior to hearings, we asked the officers to comment on various things, and one of the things that will be of interest to you is the response to your request. It's in section 12.2 of the reply report to REQ1, the non-complying activity status. So if you haven't seen that, it's on the website, but just be aware the officer has responded to that. Okay.
I do apologise, I haven't actually seen that.
That's okay.
We've been buried in Otago Regional Policy pre-hearing meetings for days, and that one's slipped past me. I apologise for that.
Right, well, that's fine.
Yeah,
I think
likewise.
That's fine. If you just address the points in your evidence, and then we'll have a discussion on that at the time. So I'll leave it in your hands now. Okay, thank you.
Would it help to just give me a heads up on what that right of reply is? Does it support or not support? It just might save me going off on a spiel about it unnecessarily.
Yes. Okay. I was going to ask the officer to clarify the advice in there, but I'll just see if I can get to the gist of it. In 12.2 of the reply report, the question that the panel asked was, your recommendation for REQ1 is to retain non-complying status for breaches of the height rule. Can you please respond to Mr. Horn's evidence, in particular how the non-complying status will align with your recommendation to have a new policy 3, which recognises the needs of important infrastructure. So we just tested whether non-complying was still appropriate, bearing in mind that there's now a recommendation for a new policy 3, which is more enabling or recognising infrastructure. And please correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Truhan, but what I'm reading there is, I think there's a recommendation for it to be discretionary. That's what I'm reading in the third paragraph of your response. The alternative to the approach would be for important infrastructure, or at least certain important infrastructure, unlikely to be able to comply with NFL rules such as telecommunication equipment, not to be subject to the gateway test at all and be considered a discretionary activity. This is what telcos seek. This would provide more certainty and be more consistent with the approach taken with the National Grid and renewable electricity generation, although this type of infrastructure is subject to imperatives with an NPS. And then there was a final paragraph. Direction in the NPS has been reflected through a discretionary activity in the EI chapter. This leaves other important infrastructure to demonstrate the merits of why they need to be located in an ONL on a case-by-case basis, which is supported by recommended policy 3. This may be appropriate given the lack of a national policy statement. So can I just ask now, just to interpret that, what is the recommendation there? Is it to go discretionary or retain non-complying? Mr. Truhan.
I guess it's discretionary is an option, given the way other important infrastructure such as the transpower assets and renewable energy is treated. But they both have national policy statements to support to recognise and provide those activities. Sorry, there's a bit of an echo. Yeah, it certainly could be considered. It would be an easier pathway for important infrastructure, but it still would allow a full assessment of effects.
Make of that what you wish, but the panel will take. There's a sort of it's an option to go discretionary, and I guess you can convince us, if you like, about the merits of that. So I'll leave that over to you now. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Graham, did you have any opening comments? You just want me to?
I suppose my opening comments go back to our original evidence about the critical nature of the infrastructure. And recently with the rural broadband project and additional cell sites being delivered by our joint company, Rural Connectivity Group, which is owned by Vodafone, Spark and 2 Degrees, delivering new cell sites into more remote parts of our rural community to enable them to experience good connectivity and services that you would expect in an urban area. And so rolling that program out has meant that we rubbed up against the ONLs and ONFs and significant areas, basically, to get significant infrastructure for those people to actually live in a modern digital world. So that's the connectivity component to it, which would therefore, while Transpower and others have a national grid policy, we're recognised in a number of national documents as, well, for us, internationally, nationally, regionally and district-wide, significant to modern life, basically. Which is interesting because that's what Chris and I have been involved in pre-hearings for Otago RPS documentation at the moment. So yeah, so having discretionary, yeah, it would work practically from our point of view because there's not a lot of these sites. So I mean, it's not like you're getting a proliferation of new sites. It's actually a very small number of sites to meet the needs of a very small population, basically. So discretionary as a planner feels good to me because you can then do the appropriate assessments, not actually dissimilar to non-complying. So hand that over to Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. So, oh, sorry, was someone saying something, or is that an echo?
Well, that was, but carry
on. So there's only 2 points in my evidence, and the first one is relatively straightforward. And that in the infrastructure chapter evidence that we did some months ago, pointed out that in the infrastructure chapter, there were policies, specifically EIP2, that recognised, had basically an effects management hierarchy for infrastructure in sensitive environments, including sensitive natural environments like ONLs. But the NFL chapter had more of an avoidance framework, and they really butt up against each other. So I made that point in evidence. The council, on the right of reply, with legal advice, accepted that point. The legal advice to council was that some change to the NFL provisions would be appropriate. The reporting officers noted that in this chapter and suggests P3, which I think is a good fix. So I support that approach. I think that gives effect to the telco submission on that point. So that's the first one. And then the second one is the one, Sir, that you've just been discussing, which is the non-complying activity status. So again, if you've got a policy framework in EIP2 in particular that has a management framework specifically recognising infrastructure, including telco, in these environments, and you have policy NFLP3, then it feels incongruent to me that you would then have to argue through a non-complying activity status to actually establish a facility under that framework. So 4 metre high height limit, there's not many wireless facilities that could practically operate at that sort of a height. Even in Queenstown, it's a permitted activity to 8 metres in an ONL, so non-complying at 4 seems particularly harsh to me. and not practical. The other development control that would trigger non-complying is the ridgeline rule, and obviously because telco wireless equipment operates on line of sight, often you've got to go for the high ground, and so there's a high risk of that ridgeline one coming into play as well. So that's not to say that everything telcos might want to do in ONLs is appropriate. There is still a management hierarchy through the policy framework to consider, and it has to be justified on its merits. So functional and operational requirements, the proportionality of the effect versus the mitigation, there's a whole lot of things to consider. So it's not open slather, it still is a process. So in my opinion, discretionary activity stays as justified. I've suggested a fix in the EI chapter, so that it only relates to infrastructure and wouldn't trigger for structures in general by trying to put a rule into the NFL chapter. So that's really a summary of what's in my evidence. So happy to take any questions.
Just on that one, Mr. Horn, just in relation to the relief you've suggested to the change to the EI REQ 12.5, I wasn't involved in that hearing, but the amendment you've suggested on your very last page at the bottom, 22, is that, so that just relates to infrastructure buildings, does it? It just appears to be quite generic, NFL R1, which in R1 relates to all buildings, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, sir. So by suggesting the fix within the EI chapter only relates to infrastructure. So it would only enable or relate to infrastructure and not buildings in general. So
okay.
Well, that's what I've intended to do. I think it works that way, but yeah, that's why I've suggested doing it in an EI rule rather than trying to change the base rule in the NFL chapter, which then, because I know there's other submitters like Federated Farmers who would like that for all structures. And so, you know, that's for them to argue. But if you want to segment out infrastructure because of the policy framework, that's the fix I've suggested, to keep it to infrastructure.
Right. Well, without having done infrastructure hearing, is there a policy in that chapter which this could hang off? In other words, this rule relates to the NFL. Is there a policy that in that chapter that would be supported by this rule? Or
Yes, the EIP2.
Yep. All right.
So EIP2 essentially recognises that infrastructure may need to go into sensitive environments like ONLs, heritage precincts, etc., and it has a cascade of considerations to look at.
Thank you. All right. Do we have any other questions? Yvette, do you have any questions? All good. Okay. Malcolm? No. Andrew? No. Very good. You're obviously very clear on your presentation. We understand it. So thank you. Thank you very much. No further questions.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Right. We'll move to the next submitter. Thank you. With North Canterbury Fish and Game, who diligently sat through the hearing yesterday. Come forward. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for coming along. Just when you're ready, just introduce yourselves, and we're in your hands. Thank you very much.
Beautiful. Great. No, so thanks. My name is Lyndon Slater. So I'm the Environmental Officer with North Canterbury Fish and Game Council. Here I've got Di Lucas. Di's a landscape architect with Lucas Associates, and she'll be presenting her evidence in support of our submission. So I'd just like to thank the commissioners for hearing us today. In our submission itself, we've addressed two chapters, largely the ecosystems and indigenous biodiversity and the natural features and landscapes. So today we'll solely be addressing the natural features and landscapes. However, to echo a number of other submissions we've heard over the last couple of days, the two chapters are inherently linked. So they do share a number of common risks and I guess benefits as well. So the natural features and landscapes chapter itself is one of particular importance to the user groups which North Canterbury Fish and Game in general represent. Angling in particular is a activity which is as much about being in the nature and part of the nature as it is about catching fish, should you be lucky enough to catch fish. So for that reason, when we consider our submission in the context of that, the completeness and contiguousness of the proposed ONLs is of a huge importance to us. Our users they're not simply driving through the landscape on the roads and are looking outwards, they're sort of within the landscapes. And so we take a far more comprehensive view of what an ONL means to our users. So in particular, our submission is addressing the proposed rules pertaining to pastoral intensification and Indigenous vegetation clearance. And Di will speak at depth on this. It doesn't need to be on depth, Di, but Di will speak to this. In particular, when we talk about the Indigenous vegetation clearance, and we understand that it is covered within the first chapter which we've submitted on. However, we do want to put a great importance on that being covered both within the landscape values and the Indigenous biodiversity values, because they're two quite separate outcomes but inherently linked as we see it. So from there, I might just pass on to Di to talk through her evidence, and then we'll cover any questions.
Yeah, certainly. So thank you for providing your statement. We've read through that and we've had some questions, but present it how you wish, but we don't expect you to read it all out.
No, I don't.
You won't do that. Okay.
Worry.
Very good, thank you.
I've also got my 2003 evidence that I did. It was quite similar. I did it for the 2003 plan. I reread it last night. Right, but before that, back in 1992, we did a report. Earl Bennett and I did a study for the Upper Waimakariri Basin. It was called Te Kohanga o Hini Hoanga. We did it as a landscape guideline development for the district. So been a bit involved in over the years. I've revisited a lot of the areas, and I'm very concerned about the lack of addressing the vegetation change, and so much of the character of these landscapes is about the vegetative cover. Both what is within it, so the elements, but also the patterns and the processes that are evident. So the provisions don't address that, and nowhere in the plan do they address that yet. It's crucial to these major nationally important landscapes, and they need to be amended, in my opinion. And if we can assist with that, we're very happy to do so. In terms of the trees and exotic trees, I think it's very good. I support the non-complying status for woodlots and shelter belts and so on within the ONLs, because I think that's important. But it's going into the VAL, there's a problem, of course, with the NES from government, the National Environmental Standard for Plantation Forestry, limiting what you can control, and because they're important in buffering and adjoining these landscapes. In my opinion, there should be provisions that are ready to go in case the NES gets changed, which could easily happen. So you need backup provisions in the plan, because if the NES gets deleted, I mean, it suddenly came in 2017, suddenly, and it could suddenly go or be changed. So you need provisions there, in my opinion, to address that. also, because we do farm planning, showing farmers how to get to carbon zero, how they might, when we look at options, exotic trees are a major method to do that. And we have done a plan with an option in this area, which has spaced exotic trees through considerable hectareages. So spaced exotic canopy trees. Are they a woodlot, a shelter belt, or whatever? You know, can you plant under these rules? Could you plant spaced canopy trees across extensive hectareages to address your carbon footprint? I think it would be good to look at that. The provisions need to encourage the regeneration and revegetation and to make it permitted for fencing, particularly following natural patterning would be good, and incentives to do that. So, so the sequestration potential from the Mānuka and the Matagari and the bracken and the getting the beech forest back through that is a great opportunity in these landscapes, and you need to encourage it. I mean, it's a big win for people if they can get to be moving towards carbon zero. But at the moment, there's not that incentive at all. I'm concerned, sorry, thank you. I'm concerned with the scale of the nodes and the lack of specificity spatially. I can't blame the lack of water on my lack of pronunciation there. So a 500 metre radius, that's 78 hectares. That's a big node. That is big. And that could go across all sorts of landforms. It is not an adequate method. And the 650 metre radius that the 5 stations seek, that's 133 hectares. Wow, that's massive for a node. So what can you do in a node and what might you not do? Because that might all again be planted with trees, 133 hectares of a block of trees or buildings. Yeah, I think in the Mackenzie, which Pat Hart mentioned yesterday, was a model for nodes, but they specifically map each one. So, you know, you can't go above it. But it could be defined. It could be defined as no elevation change, you know, not extending across different landforms or something. But yeah, I don't like the radius approach, especially the scale. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, except I'll just question, I didn't go and do my homework. Geopreservation sites, I saw they were mapped only as dots in the original 2017 study, but some of those are important deposition lands and they can be recognised in the plan to recognise their national significance. There's some that are 3-5 kilometres long, so a dot is not enough. Yeah, a 5 kilometre landform needs proper spatial recognition in the plan. So intensification is being incentivised, it's been encouraged, not only by certain product sales, but also by the Overseas Investment Office, pushing for development. And this landscape is suffering from that pressure. It's not necessarily about dairy farming. So we need to change the pressure and the encouragement. Yeah. Do I need to do something else?
No, it's good.
Thank you. We'll have a number of questions, I'm sure, but thank you for that very
Thanks for
quick
the
appraisal overall. I suppose I'll just start with one question, then I'll hand over to the panel. But what we're particularly interested in, and I signalled this at the start of the hearing, was if there is a gap, in fact, with vegetation clearance rules, bearing in mind that the EIB, or Indigenous Biodiversity hearing, hasn't taken place yet. But I noticed that there is a Section 42A report posted on the web now, and the officer involved in that hearing has recommended quite a lot of changes, it appears. Well, I haven't gone through and analysed those, but it appears that there are rules that relate to vegetation clearance in SNAs and outside SNAs as well. So, but I think the point you're making is that for landscape, for the purposes of landscape, there aren't adequate rules.
Absolutely.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that?
And when I read the rules in the biodiversity chapter, they did not address the vegetation that is important in landscape. So the naturalness provided, the landscape naturalness provided by the patterns of even it's the main species, the general species. It's not necessarily about the special stuff, so even the Matagauri patterns and the Manuka patterns and the break-in patterns, they are important part of the outstanding natural character. Now, I did make a PowerPoint, but don't worry, you can look at later. I've got some sample photos just, and you can look at them later, so that the value, the significance in landscape terms of them biophysically is the character, both in the association we have, so the associative values we have with those vegetation types, and also, just the general aesthetic of them, the colours, the greys, golds, and all that signify those landscapes. That's why it's essential. It's not just about the landforms, and they help the legibility of the landforms. They're patterning, the concentration, the base of little terracettes, and the patterning across the landforms emphasises the underlying character and points to where there's a spring, or it points to those things. And we need that, and that will not come through in a biodiversity chapter, in my opinion.
And just as a follow-up question, I guess the policy framework in this chapter, the policy 1, for instance, has a range of matters A through to K. It doesn't appear to have anything that relates to vegetation, the importance of vegetation as part of the landscape. Is that the point you're making?
And the attributes listed, as I appended them to my attachments, the attributes attached for these landscapes don't give any direction on on vegetation management. So they, as I've said, those schedules need amending as well. And it's that deposition country different from the bedrock country, and the character of those,
I'll just hand over to the other panel members first.
Sorry if I talk too much.
No, you haven't. Not any means.
Good morning, and thank you for your evidence. Sorry. Something I have a loud voice, even the microphone. I'm competing with the microphone. However, thank you. Thank you for your evidence. I've got 2 points I'd like to just cover with you. And I appreciate that you are unable to speak on behalf of mana whenua. However, I am interested in your view in terms of Te Ao Māori. And how that Te Ao Māori and those values would go across looking at the natural character of the landscape and the importance of vegetation to that natural landscape.
Yes.
How that whole integration might actually occur instead of here. Te Ao Māori looks here. And I was wondering if you had an opinion on that.
Well, very interesting, because there's lots of knowledge of the vegetation patterns and their changes through time. And I was told decades ago about ways that even after fires, how things are re-established and deliberately re-established. And I've been on trails where there have been plantings to signify locations. There's kowhai plantings, there's tikoko plantings. So there's both the culture and the nature that gets woven in, and they, to most people, they would not be legible as different. You know, they are the landscape, and so the natural vegetative cover is really, really important in Te Ao Māori, for these high country lands. And the waterways that are so important, both the tarns, the lakes, streams, the springs, these are all important. And the vegetation patterning cue to those, they lead to those, and they emphasize those. And so there's relationships with them, but there's been lived in lands, passed through lands, and you know, lands that have traditionally been, that were harvested from, but I still have a big relationship with. Yeah, so very important in the big scale and in the detail. Yeah.
So given that bigger scale, the deterioration that you opened comments in terms of when you have revisited and seen the changes that have occurred within that intrinsic landscape area. Can you give us your view in terms of when you visited there, that the effects it's the way I speak.
That's okay.
Yeah, you know, that it sounds as if I'm putting a human type, a living being on it, but I am.
Yeah.
The effects that the deterioration of the clearance of vegetation, what that actually has on the whenua, on that natural landscape body that is all a living being.
Yes. Well, you look at the big fans and you see some of these that have been cultivated and fertilized, and the huge change. And you know that the waters that are running into these, I mean, we know that the waters coming into these, they come right under the Canterbury Plains and right out here to out here into the city and out to sea. You know, this is the source of all our waters, and these fans, they're feeding our waters, and these slopes where the waters are running down, and these flats that are the expression, they're formed by the rivers, they're the expression of them, and they to convert them to monoculture of ryegrass and fodder crops and so on, is to completely transform not just the colour and texture, but the whole processes that are occurring. Because, I mean, things like the matagari that naturally belong there and concentrate on the edge and merge up, they are major for the invertebrate cover. And I mean, when you collect the matagari honey is a cue to that. I mean, they're foreign bees that come in and collect the honey for us, but matagari are really important for invertebrates. And so many of these things they're about whole systems, natural systems. And so the vegetative cover is a cue to that, into the life that belongs there. Yeah. So, yeah, it signifies a big change. Yeah.
Kia ora. And so, and just, you know, summarising, I guess, in terms of clearance of vegetation, that it would be of your view that it's really important that the both chapters for biodiversity and natural landscape have within there some ruling, some provisions that would cross-reference to each other.
Yes, it's really important that there's provisions in the landscape chapter for clearance, but yes, also complemented in the biodiversity chapter. And as I've said in my evidence, that's the 2003 one, this one, the 2022 one, re-clearance should also be addressed. So these lands, because I've mentioned they change through time, and they should not assume a fixed cover. And so if matagari or manuka, whatever, the coprosmas regenerate through these lands, you know, and you get substantial cover of that, which is what has happened in a lot of the high country, and that's fine, and because that provides great shelter and it's good habitat for sheep and so on. But if suddenly someone, especially someone new, comes and they clear it all, you know, that should require a consent for re-clearance. It shouldn't be assumed because it was once cleared that can just be cleared again. Yeah.
Kia ora. And just finally, the building note, the coverage.
Yes.
In the high country, the scale, your comment was that the scale is far too high. In terms of reviewing those provisions, what, in your view, would be an acceptable scale?
It's really hard to put a number, and I appreciate the difficulty for you people in doing that. That's why I thought that the Mackenzie drawing a line was better, but I know it's a lot of hassle to do it, and perhaps it can be a really small one, you know, sort of 50 metres, and then there's a method to go a bit bigger. So there could be a more liberal, smaller one, and then something that triggers if you want to address a bigger one. But I think there should be a provision about not stepping into other landforms. Yeah.
I think I'm there. Kia ora. Kia ora and thank you.
Thank you. Malcolm, did you have any questions?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Yvette. You've covered some of the points that I was very interested in as well. In section 33, you're talking about the importance of diverse landforms, and you note that there's no mapping in the document we have. Are there any available maps that have been done already that could be inserted anywhere?
Right. On my PowerPoint, at the end of, I've made a PowerPoint, don't worry about it today, but I've put a link on it to all our land type mapping so that you can use that.
Right.
So that's been done by Manaaki Whenua and down to the 50,000 scale. And so you'll be able to use that.
Wonderful. And the other point was here somewhere. 60.
And if
Yes,
there's a gap,
60, you're talking about the change and intensification of farming practices. The comment is made that all new land uses lead to visual difference in the landscape, should be controlled to avoid diverse landscape effects. Do you have any suggestions to how we could achieve that?
So is this in the same paragraph?
No, this is in paragraph 60.
60.
This is Waimakariri landscape threats.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I just wondered if you had any suggestions as to how we could achieve what you're seeking there.
So primarily that's about vegetation change, both the paddock surface, but also the shelter belt stuff, and you know, the cropping and so on, as well as the irrigation, you know, the management of that land. And that none of that is addressed. So you can go in and put a plough in and turn on an irrigator and plant a row of trees. The plan's silent on that, except for a shelter belt here.
Thank you, Di. That's all I've got.
Yeah, Malcolm, Andrew. Thank you for your evidence, Ms. Lucas. Thank you also for those helpful the figures, the diagrams, etc. They're really useful. So thank you for including those. I do have a couple of questions, well, a few questions. Just work my way through. Mostly points of clarification. So your paragraph 25 and 26, you talk about the RPS or the regional study.
Yes.
Include all, yeah, these include all the ONL and the PDP. And then in 26, you talk about the ONL delineating out or excluding farmed depositional lands. So just a point of clarification, were those farmed depositional lands that you've said have been largely excluded, were they included in the regional study?
Yes, they're included in the regional study and excluded in the district plan.
I thought that's what you meant.
So
Thank you.
there's a duty. Yeah.
Yes. Your paragraph 42, just a point of clarification, your second line says, however, as has been found elsewhere, attributes listed for a regional district-wide assessment to evaluate, etc. So where do you mean it has been found elsewhere? Do you mean, what is elsewhere?
Oh gosh, I had it clear when I wrote it. I'm working on too many
That's right.
places.
I was wondering, was it in your evidence and I missed it, or was it, you mean you're referring to other authorities?
Yeah,
or
other authorities.
Other authorities.
Other
okay.
authorities. And I could.
Okay.
Yeah. What's happened, yes, is so attributes. One thing is to decide if it's ONL or not. Is that area ONL or not? Does it meet the thresholds? But then to assess proposals, they're not necessarily the same tests. And so they've had, the Coromandel plan, yeah, I am on that one at the moment. They rewrote for the assessment methods.
So that's a good example, the Coromandel plan.
Yeah, I think so. I'd need to check. I'll be working on it sometime later in the week, but I can check.
Okay, just interested in
Yeah.
you providing, I guess, in your opinion, a good example.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and I think, you've suggested you've suggested that a number of changes need to be made, but you haven't provided any wording at any point. And I guess you've done that on purpose. Can you point us again to any examples where you think it's been done well for the issues that you seek us to
I
address?
could provide further information to the panel if that would be desired.
I guess I'm interested in specific wording, I think, for provisions.
Yes, yes, I can provide.
Yeah, I think that I was going to raise, if I can just interject, I was going to raise this at the end too, was that it's a possibility, and it's only a possibility because the panel hasn't discussed this yet, that we might ask for some further work to be done by the officers and possibly you as a submitter.
Happy to do
And
conference.
I was going to ask in terms of Mr. Slater and who's an environmental officer and yourself, in terms of wordsmithing and district plan provisions between you, do you feel you could participate in that exercise in terms of drafting rules and
absolutely
in conjunction with the officers, of course? And I'm only signalling it at this stage. We haven't discussed it, but rather than you just sending us a whole lot of stuff, we would direct what it is we wanted exactly. So
I'd prefer that.
all right. So we'll come back to that after we've heard the presentations.
That I'm happy to respond.
All right.
Thank you. And my last question is back to paragraph 60 that we've already had a question on. And you talked about a threat as identified change and intensification of farming practices, and that all new land uses that lead to a visual difference in the landscape should be controlled. I guess I'm just wondering, is that actually practical in a working landscape, that approach? Is it really practical to achieve that? All new uses that lead to a visual difference in the landscape? I'm just thinking about a threshold, how we might apply that approach as well. And again, do you have an example of where this has been done elsewhere?
I think for a new land use, I think it is reasonable to address that. Yes.
And what's a change in land use? Is that planting or cropping or? Because in terms of district plans, we need to. Well, you can either be very broad and just basically say anything, or we could be a bit more helpful and try and identify those key changes. And I think the district plan tries to do that now with shelter belts and plantation forestry, etc. So you're saying you'd like to sort of have a finer sieve and cast the net a little bit.
Well, you have a really important landform. It's a major feature in the landscape, with a big fan or a big terrace. It looks totally high in natural, very high in naturalness, because it's dry land, vegetation cover, though it might not be entirely indigenous, but you suddenly cut a big rectangle in that and sow it in lucerne. That's a complete transformation in the landscape that is a big change. Big change. And it doesn't need the irrigation and all the other stuff coming in. You can just do that. We all know we can just do it. So
are there any other district plans that manage change in land uses to the extent that you're suggesting here?
Mackenzie.
So Mackenzie is okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
And just on the Mackenzie one, there was a hearing not that long ago in Plan Change 18 that I
didn't go to that hearing, but
I was actually on the panel for
ones.
that. and the chair of this hearing panel, Rob van Voorthuizen, was the chair of that. So both of us were on that hearing panel. So when you talk about the Mackenzie provisions, are you talking about the Plan Change 18 provisions or previous provisions?
And there's the earlier ones, yes.
About the earlier ones,
yes.
Maybe. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. And I understand that's subject to appeal as well.
Right. Yes.
All right. No, look. Thank you. That's all the questions. Yeah, that's all the questions we have. We may come back, and after we've heard all the evidence, we might ask for some more work to be done. But that's in response to not providing us any detailed provisions to look at. But that's. I think you've made the point, and you've highlighted the concerns. So we'll take it from there and come back to you if need be. Okay.
Yes, because what you put in the schedules affects what you put in the schedules. You have to do the two together, really. Yes, and didn't think I should just redraft that.
That's fine. It's sensible. All right. No, thank you very much. We have no further questions for Fish and Game. Thank you very much. Right. We're now starting a sort of a hybrid hearing. We're starting hearing 20, and we're hearing from submitters who've also got something to say about hearing 19, so or chapter on natural features and landscape and coastal environment. So this is just to help them not have to come twice. And so the first submitter we have up is Transpower New Zealand Limited. So we'll hear from your team, and then we'll.
Can I just say, I know you've finished with us, but from my thesis on vegetation change in this area, there was a one-page article done on it in 1994, and so we've just run a copy for you of the one page.
That's fine. If
you.
Yep, just hand it to Grace. She'll do that.
I know it's old.
Welcome back to us, Nancy. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
I hope I can be very, very brief today.
Thank you for providing a statement, and we've got that. So, yeah, take us through that.
Thank you.
I'll just make a comment at the start that there's a lot of reference to the energy and infrastructure chapter, and thankfully Commissioner Willis was part of that panel, and I'm not sure whether the other panel members were. So we've got Andrew who's up with the plate on that, and it does appear to be quite complex, the cross references. So you might need to spend a little bit more time with me on those when you come to those parts. Okay.
Yes, that's fine. I think there's a high level of agreement between me and the recommendations in the Section 42A report, so that's quite helpful. In terms of both the NFL and coastal environment chapters, I agree with the 42A report that a specific policy should be included in those chapters that directs how the effects of important infrastructure are managed in those special environments, if you like. Where I disagree with the Section 42A report conclusions is that I'm not sure that the new policies completely cure the avoidance policies in the earlier part. So it's how you find your way to the new policy when there is an avoidance policy already. How can you avoid and then consider the particular matters in the new policy? So what I've suggested in my evidence is in the case of the NFL chapter, referring directly to the effects hierarchy in the energy and infrastructure chapter. And I think that's what Mr. Horn just referred to earlier, the EIP2, that already directs how effects should be managed for important infrastructure in natural features and landscapes and visual amenity landscapes and that kind of thing. The coastal environment's a little bit more complicated because there isn't actually that friction between the energy and infrastructure chapter and the coastal environment chapter. And what I've suggested in my evidence there is a different new policy, if you like, that sets out how seek to avoid for the national grid, and then those particular considerations that reflect the same as the Section 42A report. The seek to avoid is critical to give effect to the national policy statement for electricity transmission, but I have noted there that you may want to look at a similar framework for important infrastructure in general. That's really all I had to say about objectives and policies. Now, in the context of the rules in both environments, I've agreed with the Section 42A report that the rules in the energy and infrastructure chapter would apply to the national grid for new national grid and also for the operation, maintenance and repair of the national grid. The issue that I highlight in my evidence is that in the case of upgrading of the national grid, there's quite a complex cross-referencing that would effectively take you to a non-complying activity status. So it's a little bit odd that if you were to upgrade the national grid in those special environments, you would require a resource consent for a non-complying activity, whereas if you were going to build new national grid in those environments, it would be a discretionary activity. What I've suggested in my evidence, and it's the same as the remedy I suggested in my energy and infrastructure chapter evidence, is that rather than deferring to the activity status in the other chapters, you effectively say where you would trigger a consent because you're located in those special environments, it just defaults to discretionary, but that direction is included in the energy and infrastructure chapter. Just to simplify the cross-referencing across the plan, I'm not suggesting a consent ought not be required, just that the activity status be at least the same as if you were building new infrastructure.
That's right, and as I tested with Mr. Horn or asked him today, he said that there are relevant policies, P2, I think it is, in the energy and infrastructure, yes, which would support such a cross-reference, and also the potential new policy 3 in the NFL chapter, which recognises important infrastructure. That's something you're clearly supporting, isn't it?
Yeah, what I suggested is that the policy P3 in the NFL chapter just directly reference EIP2 rather than having two effects management regimes. That EIP2 is the policy that you go to understand how you manage effects of important infrastructure and natural features and landscapes, rather than also having NFL P1 and NFL P2 applying with those avoid policies. And that's where that friction and tension arose in the energy and infrastructure chapter. And what I'm suggesting is the plan be crafted in a way that says for important infrastructure, EIP2 is the policy, not all of them.
And the changes you've got at paragraph 27, is that where you address that?
Yes, effectively, I've suggested that the policy should be written in that way that directs you to EIP2.
That's right. All right, thanks. No further questions, but I'll hand over to panel. Any questions? Malcolm?
Yeah, upgrading. 37. I'm just interested in 37A. It means that upgrading above ground utilities not need to comply with E1 Rec 12. I'm just concerned, we are in a changing technological environment, and when you're talking of upgrading, is that just upgrading of the grid itself, or could that mean an upgrade as in the solar farm being attached to the grid?
The solar farm would be a renewable electricity generation activity and would be dealt with under different rules. My interest is the upgrading of electricity transmission activities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you for your evidence, Mr. Carr. Paragraph 18, you distinguish between avoid and seek to avoid. And yes, and I'm just interested in that. Can you sort of elaborate a bit more on the differences between those two? And if you've got any examples about, what's a real world application of those two to Transpower's development, where something would be avoid versus seek to avoid?
Well, the seek to avoid are the words that are used in policy 8 of the national policy statement. And the way I've always understood them is you make best endeavours to avoid, but when you read the national policy statement as a whole, there's this recognition that linear infrastructure, like the national grid, or in this case, the national grid, is not always able to avoid. And I understand the national policy statement to be saying you've got to make best endeavours to not be in these places. But when you do, the NPSCT sets out a specific effects management regime, and it talks about operational needs of the national grid, and it talks about the need to when considering means to avoid, remedy or mitigate the adverse effects, to think about the site, route and method selection. So it directs that whole consideration of where you're going to go, but acknowledges that there will be situations where avoidance isn't possible.
Sure.
Yeah.
Doesn't the, I guess, the planning approach that avoids but provides or recognises the importance of infrastructure and the very matters that you've raised, and provides a consent pathway anyway for that assessment, doesn't that achieve the same thing?
Yes, it does, but I don't think that the NFL P1 and P2 do that, because they don't qualify the avoidance in those policies. There's an absolute avoid.
Sure.
That's my problem. If NFL P1 and P2, I think I'm referring to the right policies, had some direction that there would be circumstances where important infrastructure can't avoid, or something to that effect. But at the moment, it just says avoid.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, it's about having a pathway through that avoidance for the national grid, or more generally important infrastructure, if that's where you want to go.
Sure, because I mean that is provided for in the energy and infrastructure policy, though, isn't it? So recognise important, can demonstrate operational and functional requirements for the location, can demonstrate through site, route, method selection, minimisation of effects on the environment, and integrate design measures that manage effects. So yeah, EIP2. So there is stuff in that policy around recognising components of and requirements of infrastructure. Yeah.
Yes, but I'm not sure how you, without doing something in the NFL chapter, I'm not sure how you reconcile the direction in EIP2 with NFL P1 and
linkage,
P2.
isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
You've got to get yourself to that consideration, and you can't get through the avoid hurdle to get there.
Sure. So paragraph 28, you've said as a consequence, I suggest the wording of EIP2. That's the policy can be tightened to refer to schedules.
Yes.
I understand. Have you provided any wording to that? Would you literally just reference those schedules in the policy?
I think, well, I think that's an acknowledgement of the fact that the expression that through the 42A report here, there's the reference to those values, and I'm merely suggesting that it would be useful to also reference those values in EIP2, so that consideration is equivalent to the consideration you'd give to those values under the NFL chapter.
Sure. So I understand why, but I didn't see any suggested amendment.
I haven't suggested the wording, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it's just,
it's simply making sure those values are really explicitly set out. Yeah.
all right. No, thank you. No further questions.
No further questions. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We'll now move to Orion. Thank you for coming along. Welcome to the hearing, Ms. Appleyard.
Yes, thank you. I haven't been out here for a wee while, so it's a bit of a treat.
Very good. Yeah,
I think you're nearly at the end of these chapters, aren't you? Other than rezoning. So
getting there. Yeah, we certainly are. I think there's a hearing on Indigenous biodiversity coming up in early August, but we're certainly getting near the end of these ones, these top chapter-related ones. Yeah.
Yes. I was actually just going to start with a request before we give our evidence, and I don't know whether it was me just coming to the party late or not, but last night I became aware of some questions that had been asked by the hearings panel and some responses that had been given by the council officer. And I was particularly interested in the questions that were asked around paragraph 11.4 officer's report, which was a question about clarifying why change to Rule 1 in the NFL chapter is not also required to follow up on some changes to policy. And also in relation to paragraph 12.46, which was a question around scope, and I note that Orion are going to be asked to comment on that as well. I only saw this for the first time last night, and I'm not sure when Ms. Foote saw it, and I just wondered whether it would be appropriate for the council officer to perhaps take us through the answers that have been given and elaborate on that before we launch into making comment, because I'm not completely sure that I understand the answers that have been given.
Yeah, that's fine. We have that process I mentioned with the telcos today, that we ask the questions prior to the hearing. Normally what the officers do is cover it in their reply, but I think if it helps your presentation and makes things more efficient.
I'm not sure I understand the answers. So.
You know, that's fine.
Yeah.
And I hope if Mr. Trun, are you comfortable with just explaining? I don't want to have a sort of a discussion between parties, but if you can help clarify what is intended with the comments, that would be useful for the response. Okay. So
and it's more in relation to 12.46 than 11.4, but if we could just go through both of them, that would be helpful.
Chapter 19, isn't it?
Yes.
19. Okay. All right. So which ones again? Sorry.
So the first question that was asked was in relation to the officer's paragraph 11.4, where the officer had said there was a need to include some policies to ensure consistency with the EI chapter, which we agree with. But then he makes a comment that he doesn't consider the change to the rule is required. And the panel had asked a question about clarify why change to the rule is not required. And I just wasn't sure that I understood the answer that was given. So I wanted to perhaps give some opportunity just to clarify that.
That's right.
At first. If we just perhaps deal with that one first and then I do the next one. Yeah.
So yeah, that's right. Are you able just to expand on, or at least clarify what the response was?
Yeah, sure. So I think the Orion relief was to exclude important infrastructure from NFL R1. So then how you'd address important infrastructure would be in relation to the structures would be through the EI rules, but there wouldn't be any, because of the way it's structured, the reference is through to the NFL rules, so there wouldn't be any, so it wouldn't be clear how they're to be dealt with in NFL, the Orion infrastructure, for example. So I guess that's what I'm saying. Yeah, there'd be a bit of a logic gap. There's you know, there's nothing to sort of anchor how important infrastructure would be dealt with when in the NFL overlay. Does that make sense? It's just there's a bit of it. So if you exclude important infrastructure from NFL R1. It's not clear how it would be dealt with. Would it just default to the EI rules? In which case, those rules might make it it might be a permitted activity, which might be inappropriate in the NFL in an NFL overlay. So currently, it could be a non-complying activity. If it's excluded from NFL R1, it might become a permitted activity, and a permitted activity might not be appropriate in an ONL overlay. So that's my point. And the point that I make further on in relation to that other paragraph was that you know, you might consider a discretionary activity as a sort of compromise, not non-complying, but discretionary activity, which would still allow a fuller assessment of effects. That's the scope issue.
Yeah, so we haven't fully considered that ourselves, but we'll probably ask for clarification in the reply report, subject to anything you want to tell us about that now.
Yeah, well, I'll let Ms. Foote comment on it, but I think my comment would be fairly much similar to the panel's questions, that we're putting in these policies, and rules are meant to implement policy, and it does seem a bit odd that we've got a rule implementing a policy that is intended to make things easier for infrastructure. We're going to end up as a non-complying activity. It does seem a little bit odd. That does not seem to be a rule that is implementing that policy. That's just as a general comment. Mel, I don't know if you want to comment on that now or you want to deal with it at the time.
Just on the same page, I guess, as you.
I'm sure we understand that concern, and that's similar to the question I asked Mr. Horn too,
Yes.
in relation to non-complying status, and is there a policy that supports it being non-complying?
Yeah, and the two seem at odds with each other. We're putting in some policies, but we're having a role that's actually not going to implement this policy, is actually going to do the opposite. Okay, and then the next one was in relation to 12.46. Paragraph 12.46, which was, as I understand it, there's some problems with the drafting of the current rule where subsection 3, I think it is, all the other rules refer to buildings and structures. Is it point 3 refers only to buildings, and the question was, well, how do we fix that? Is there some scope to make this change? And there seems to be an answer that relies on a submission made by Orion, but the submission made by Orion on the basis of the reading of the report has actually been withdrawn or abandoned because we were happy with what was being suggested in the EI chapter. So we're now trying to resurrect it to rely on it to fix a problem, and to fix a problem in a way which isn't going to be helpful to Orion. So I wasn't sure whether the concern was fixing the problem more generally to get a reference to structures back in there, or it was intended to fix a problem related to Orion.
Was the submission abandoned or just not pursued?
Not pursued on the basis of what we understood was in the EI chapter. And I don't think we can rely on Orion submission to fix a problem with the plan that is going to make things worse for Orion. Orion will just withdraw the submission. So I wasn't sure whether the question and therefore the answer was designed to fix problems with structures generally, but there would be an understanding that that issues related to Orion would be addressed separately, in which case we're happy to deal with scope if you need to rely on Orion's submission. But if it's going to backfire on Orion and their submission is going to be relied on to make life more difficult for them, we will be withdrawing the submission. So we're not trying to be difficult. But I don't want to put my client in a worse position by pursuing a submission that's actually going to ultimately backfire on it. That all probably leads me to a suggestion that maybe there are some planners, Ms McLeod, the council officers, and Ms Foot, and anybody else that there may benefit from some caucusing or discussion around how we solve this problem.
Okay, so now that you've raised that, Mr. Truant, do you have any further comment to make on that and suggestion, or has that been understood correctly in your view?
Yeah, and I actually realised, apologies. I think actually I might have not directly answered the question in my response. I think I was probably referring to the previous comment, previous point about non-complying activities. Yeah, I'm not sure there is scope, but there might be some. But at first blush, I didn't think there was scope. But as the submitter has said, that it wouldn't benefit them necessarily to have it in. So I guess that we've been advised that there might not be scope, and if you think there is, or if there's any,
I think there probably is scope, but I'm not going to put that forward in a way that quite bluntly backfires on the client. So I think there is ways and means in which, if the problem is a general problem with some drafting that just needs to be addressed generally, I think there's some ways we can pick our way through that. But if the mischief that's intended to be addressed here is my client, I'm not inclined to put that forward. But I think I can probably be helpful if the issue here that is trying to be addressed is a more general one around, we've just missed the wording structures and Orion has dealt with to its satisfaction. I think there's some ways through that we could helpfully pursue through caucusing.
Have discussion about that later. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
So just then into the way we're going to present, the issues have become quite narrowly focused. So I wasn't going to actually go through my legal submissions. I was just going to get Mr Hayes and then Ms Foot to present. If that's.
I should point out too, I was remiss not to do that, that there was, at the start of the hearing process, it was decided that the councillors, who are members of the panel, would not take part in the questioning or deliberation. So Commissioner Lyle will sit back and not ask any questions on this one. It's an abundance of caution more than anything, I think. So
Yes.
I should have mentioned that earlier, sorry. Anyway, Mr. Hayes, thank you for your statement.
Morning. My name is Gary Hayes. I'm the Procurement and Land Services Manager at Orion New Zealand Limited. Orion Network and the proposed ONLs. Orion's electric distribution infrastructure in the proposed outstanding natural landscape ONL areas is primarily 3 high voltage 11 kV or 11,000 volt feeders, each made up of a series of lines, poles and ground mounted equipment. Orion's network in the high country has a number of characteristics that distinguish it from other rural areas in the Selwyn. There are currently no standalone Orion-owned substations in the high country areas. Instead, they are co-located at Transpower's facility at Castle Hill and Arthurs Pass and at the Coleridge Power Station owned by Manawa Energy, formerly Trustpower. Orion does not own or operate any any sub-transmission lines in the high country or ONL areas. The vast majority of Orion lines and associated support structures and poles in ONLs are located over boundary on private land and not within the road corridor. Network location, operation and upgrade is guided and constrained by the location of the existing network, customer need and technical constraints such as terrain, environment and cost. Given this, rules which require the location of structures either within the road corridor or at least 300 metres from it and the railway corridor are problematic, and the rules that limit infrastructure to be predetermined height or are inconsistent with the upgrade needs are problematic. Orion's network in the high country generally consists of overhead network based around a series of lines and poles, and a vast majority of which are 8 to 10 metres in height. This is different from the national grid and the towers that Transpower owns and operates in the high country, which can be approximately 18 to 20 metres in height. Furthermore, each of Orion's 3 high country feeders are critical to maintaining supply to the surrounding area. As explained in my evidence, they are not physically connected to the rest of Orion's distribution network. The singular and isolated nature of the feeders means that it is not possible to backfeed an electricity supply where the flow of the electricity is interrupted through a fault or infrastructure change. Supply cannot be restored until the source of the interruption is removed and or damage remedied. In contrast, in lowland and urban areas, electricity can often be directed via other lines to maintain supply and minimize outages. Operation, repair, maintenance, upgrade and expansion of Orion network within the proposed ONLs. Orion's activities in the high country are essentially the same as what occurs elsewhere in our rural network areas. This includes pole and conductor replacement / refurbishment and earthworks. It is important that the proposed plan is permissive in terms of operation, maintenance, repair and upgrade of existing electricity distribution infrastructure. This will ensure we can continue to provide a safe, secure and reliable supply of electricity to the high country areas of the Selwyn district. Significant growth is not forecasted in the high country, and therefore Orion is not currently planning any substantive new work within the proposed ONL areas in the next decade. Should major new developments be proposed, such that complete new spans or sections of overhead network are required, Orion recognises it may be appropriate that consents are required. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I just had one question in relation to the last paragraph. I understand what you're saying there, that you're really seeking good provisions in relation to maintenance and maybe upgrading of existing infrastructure, but I think what you're saying there is that any new spans, completely new spans or sections, should go through a consent process. Is that what Orion's position is? I thought Ms. Foote was asking for provisions that outside the road corridor, new sections would not be, or is it an activity status thing? Maybe Ms. Foote can address that. But is it as simple as that? That any new span, you'd be happy to go through a consent process?
I think what we're saying here is that within the 3 areas that we've sort of designated in the evidence that provided, if we were looking to expand on that significantly, then we'd look to seek consents as required.
Fine, we'll come back to that, but I certainly thank you for your evidence on the technical side of things, and that's well understood. So thank you for that. I'm not sure if we have any further questions, Yvette, Mr. Hayes. Any questions? No. Nothing. No. What are you thinking? Oh, you can't ask questions, of course. Yeah, Andrew. No, thank you for that. That's helpful. All right, we'll go to Ms. Ford. Thank you.
Good morning. Just a few issues I'd like to touch on where there's still some outstanding issues. Firstly, Coastal Environment Rule 3.7. Mr. Truen has proposed to amend CER 3.7 to exclude ancillary structures. I agree with that amendment. However, while 3.7 has been amended, 3.4 still applies to ancillary structures. Therefore, we're seeking exemption as per my amendments in my evidence in chief, as this clause is applicable to ancillary structures. Then on to natural features and landscapes, Rule 1. I still disagree with a linkage for EIR 11, 19 and 27, as this is overly restrictive for Orion in relation to the erection of utility poles in particular. Under the operative plan, Rule 5511 permits a height limit of 8 metres for utility structures. So Orion seek that the proposed rules don't become more restrictive than what the current regime we operate under. I note Orion operates a linear network which must link to where the demand is, and I recommend an amendment to NFL 11 to exclude network utility poles with a maximum height of 8 metres.
Just sorry if I can interrupt. So just on my previous question, you're asking for permitted activity status for poles that are more than 8 metres high. Is that right?
That's up to 8 metres.
Right. So new poles as part of a new section of
maintenance and upgrade if they have to replace a pole.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I understand that. Thank you. Carry on.
NFL REQ4 building and structure setbacks. This rule requires all structures to be set back at least 300 metres from the centre line of State Highway 73 and the Midland Railway line. I consider there needs to be an exemption which provides for the upgrading and minor relocation of Orion's existing network utility poles up to 8 metres in height within the 300 metre setback from the State Highway and the railway line without a consenting burden. I propose an amendment to the rule to exclude network utility poles with a maximum height of 8 metres. And finally, NFL Rule 2 with regard to earthworks. Compliance with NFL R2 is an issue for Orion, as very few of Orion's assets within ONLs in the Category High Country follow road corridors. So many of their lines run at right angles to the road. I propose an amendment to this rule to provide for any earthworks that are for the replacement, maintenance, repair and upgrading of an existing utility pole to be a permitted activity within the various overlays. And that's all the comments I have. Happy to answer any questions.
I just wondered whether there's anything you want to add to the discussion on or the answers given on paragraph 11.4 and 12.46. And in particular, the question, can I ask why I've changed to Rule 1 is not also required? Just commentary on that. Know what your position is, but
yeah, I guess there's a bit of tension there, isn't there? You've got a non-complying status and then a policy that's trying to allow for yeah, so they're at odds, so there needs to be tweaked. I'm happy to work with.
You would oppose non-complying, obviously, but discretionary,
yes.
Would that be what you would be comfortable with, potentially?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
And then the other question around the scope, and I'm just really asking you to clarify your evidence. Your understanding was that you would not be pursuing that position, submission, or we'd be withdrawing it on the basis that your understanding was that the EI chapter would remain as effectively as been discussed at previous hearings. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've got one question, and that's in relation to the poles. I think Mr. Hayes did say that the vast majority of the poles are between 8 and 10 metres in height. And I'm just wondering, do you know how the 8 metres came about? Why is there a height limit of 8 metres? Is there any science
I
behind
think
it?
that's the majority of the poles would be 8 metres, and that's just where it's always landed.
Some will be more than 10.
Pardon?
Okay.
And the current plan's 8 metres as well, and that's.
Yeah. I guess what I'm asking is, why has the current plan got an 8 metre height limit for poles?
I don't know the history of the.
So generally the height of the pole is to ensure that we have clearance above the ground for the voltages that we're at, and because these are predominantly 11 kV lines, well in fact they're all 11 kVs with maybe a bit of underbuild of 400 underneath them, that's the height that we need to do. So we don't make them any higher than we need to. So 8 metres above ground, obviously the poles are longer than that.
Vast majority are about 8 metres, and some will potentially require consent depending on what the panel decides about that rule. Okay, all right, understood. Thank you. See if any other questions. First of all, Yvette.
I'm around the poles as well. So it's a standard requirement from underground and above ground, and it's not one that has ever been addressed to look at reducing or adding to. It's a required standard, just to clarify that.
I'd suggest that it would only ever increase, it wouldn't decrease, and it's just basically to ensure that we have electrical distances between the ground and the usage underneath it as well. I think ECP 34 stipulates most of those heights are sort of thing. So that's NZ ECP 34.
And also for clarification too, within the evidence, is that the poles you would argue are actually part of the natural character within the high country.
I'd say yes.
Leading question.
Yeah, leading question.
Very good.
Okay, it was clarification. Sure, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your evidence. Look, just a couple of questions of clarification. Paragraph 15, it's a very minor matter. It's been fixing my mind. So you've added a new clause B to 3.4, and I understand why you're proposing to do that. My question is quite simple. Is it at the end of A, is it supposed to be or the structure is a network utility pole? I.e. it applies anywhere within the coastal environment. I just want to make sure. Yes?
Yeah.
Thank you, because that makes a difference. Okay. And my last question, paragraph 25, you're proposing to add an exclusion for network utility poles. And again, I understand why. It's just, I noticed that the reporting officer has recommended to exclude ancillary structures already from REQ4. So would that satisfy would that achieve the relief sought anyway? Because the ancillary structures refers to poles less than a metre in diameter and 8 metres in height. Would that achieve the same outcome? Or have I misunderstood the reporting officer's recommendation?
I don't think it covers it adequately still.
So Appendix 2, NFL REQ4, excluding public community structures, ancillary structures, irrigation structures, stockyards, animal pens, and stock loading ramps. So it includes ancillary structures, which is defined as which includes a pole which is less than 1 metre in diameter and a freestanding is less than 8 metres in height.
Yeah, I'd have to have a closer think about that.
Sure.
Yeah,
thank
no,
you.
I'm pretty sure there was.
Just don't want to exclude ancillary structures and then
Yeah.
also exclude something which is already caught by the definition. That's all. Or you can clarify if it doesn't achieve the same relief.
Yeah, I'll come back to you on that, and I have an overquote.
We're about to take a break shortly, and so if you can do that in the next 15 minutes, it would save you having to.
Yeah, we have quite a lot.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. No
Thank
further
you.
questions.
Thank you very much. That's all we had for you. We're in danger of being right on time, so it's really pleasing. So yes, we'll take a short break and come back in 15 minutes for the next submitter, which is Christchurch City Council. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Well, welcome back. Have you had a chance to have a look at that?
Yes, I have. Thank you.
Yep.
No, I reviewed the amendments to the Section 42A report and happy that ancillary structures will cover off the relief we sought. So, yeah.
You'd be happy with that
We're happy
relief?
with that,
Yeah. Okay. No, that's thanks for confirming that. It's nice of you to stay on and do that rather than have to come back at another time. So thank you very much. All right. We'll move on. Thank you for that. We'll move on to Christchurch City Council now. We've got Kirk Lightbody, Jeremy Head, Landscape Architect. Yeah, very good. Come forward, gentlemen. Just when you're ready, just introduce yourselves and we'll take it from there. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, panel. So my name's Kirk Lightbody. I'm representing City Council today. I'm a planner at the city. And I've got with me Jeremy Head from WSP. He's our landscape architect in this project here. I'm not. Yep. Thank you. I don't have a big spiel, but I'm just open to questions really. But just the overall message from us is that the City Council is here to ensure that consistent framework is implemented across the territorial authorities over the Port Hills ONFL. And we're open to questions on how to help you with making a decision.
I'll just hand over to the panel to see if we have any questions. I'll start with Malcolm, if you've got any questions. None? Good. You need a bit of time. Yeah. You're all good for now? Okay. Andrew, you'll leave.
Yeah, thank you. So it is interesting. I think it is reading through the evidence of yourself, Mr. Head, that there is a difference in the rules provisions, but actually your professional assessment is that in practice there might not be that much of a different outcome. Yeah, so that was very helpful. Thank you for stepping us through that. That was the only sort of clarification question for that one. Mr. Lightbody, just looking at my question here. Yes, your paragraph 6.11 is the only question I have. You've said in there, I agree with Mr. Truman's recommendations. However, I disagree as it relates to accessory buildings and recommend a restriction on the number of new buildings outside a node within the Banksman ONL. Do you have any advice on what that should be? 6.11, so that's for Mr. Lightbody.
Sorry, if you repeat that, so I just said
Yes.
last bit.
Yeah, sure. Your paragraph 6.11, you refer to, you recommend a restriction on the number of new buildings outside a node within the Banks Peninsula ONL. Yeah. Do you have any advice or recommendation on what that restriction would look like?
In my opinion, it'd be a number
Yes.
of buildings over a whole site.
Yes.
Currently, there's this the system there is meters squared, which would enable multiple across the site. Just it's reflecting back on the city plan, which only labels one at 100 squares as a consistent with cell and then but it would really depend on the farming activities on the cell and district side of the boundary, which I'd lean on Mr. Head's landscape analysis of, if you like.
So the spectrum being what the cell and district plan provides for, proposed plan at one end, and the Christchurch district plan, which is one, at the other, you're saying somewhere between the two?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. 2 or 3, 4, depends on what the farming activities are.
Right.
Which I believe are generally sheep activities or sheep. Yeah. Which shouldn't need huge sheds in the first place or proliferation of them, which would be permitted as currently proposed. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Thank you. That's my only question.
Thank you. Yeah, I haven't got a lot of questions really, but just in terms of the consistency across districts, am I reading it right that you've looked at the statutory side of it, and have you made the case that there is a requirement for us to be consistent, or is it a matter of good practice, planning practice in your view?
It's good practice.
It's good practice.
Yeah,
Okay.
rather than a requirement. It's just to have regard to, not to give effect to another plan.
Right.
Yeah.
And your case for Christchurch standards being appropriate in Rule 1, for instance, is that based on the fact that your plan's been through a pretty rigorous hearing process and decisions and appeals and everything else, or is there a sort of a planning reason why we should follow the same types of rules there?
Yeah. Just on that, it's not the IHP process. It's per planning view that it's probably not a good idea to have unlimited permitted activities in terms of those accessory buildings. But we're quite happy with the rest of the provisions that's proposed in terms of reflecting the city plan. Yes, in that area.
I've got no further questions of you, and I'll just see if we have any questions for Mr. Head's evidence. Do you have any questions there, Andrew, of Mr. Head?
No, I don't.
I don't either, I'm sorry. I'd like to ask you a question, but it fully understood. Thank you very much. And you haven't been sitting through the whole hearing, so I won't ask you any questions outside your brief. There was actually, I will ask you a question just to see if you're prepared to answer it. It's to do with reflectance values and how they accurately reflect. How they deal with colour and the impact of colour on the landscape. And we had some evidence yesterday about how quite gaudy colours can have a relatively low reflectance value, and whether the rule that only relates to reflectance value is appropriate when we're dealing with colour and the effects of colour on the landscape. And please only answer it if you feel comfortable to do so. But you are a qualified landscape architect. We'd quite like to know your view on it.
Yeah, that's it's a really good question, and it's something that I come up, need to address often. So on the one hand, you have the light reflectance value, which is it's a scientific value that is applied basically at a colour lab to paint. And so if you look at all the British standard colours and the Rosine colours and things, they will all have an LRV of some value, which is great. But as you correctly note, that also allows for colours that might not be appropriate, such as, say for example, reds and oranges and pinks and things that might be dark enough and recessive enough to meet those standards. So what I often include in my landscape assessments and peer reviews and things is that it's good to have an LRV that is low, say 40% and below, in hues of grey, green and brown. Okay, so colours from that colour palette. Yeah,
that's fine. That's a useful answer. And in terms of, in fact, you have partly addressed it in your evidence anyway. But in terms of the planning side of it, we had another rule suggested to us that involved those sorts of words. It didn't specify the actual colours like grey or brown or whatever it might be, but it talked about contextual, blending and with the landscape. Are you familiar with anything in the Christchurch plan that deals with that particular value or not? Not offhand.
The Christchurch plan doesn't go into rules; it uses meta discretion instead. So it doesn't have that it's agreed, quite a hard rule to make.
Discretion, it's much easier to explain what you're intending. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now look, that's useful to have that answer, and we'll have to consider that one further. But look, thank you. I don't think we've got any questions on. Oh, sorry.
Paragraph 23. I was interested in the upper limit. And given that on the Selwyn side, the crater rim is quite significant to Manawhenua in terms of the landscape up there in the names that are associated with whakapapa around there. So the upper limit in terms of buildings encroaching further up. You said, however, there is no upper limit to the location of buildings other than the through matters of use and matters of discretion through there. Can you just elaborate more on that in terms of do you see, looking at the rules that we within the district plan Selwyn, I would just like to hear your views about that and how we might be able to get upper levels brought into there and Christchurch City Council said that has been important.
Yes, I mean, typically the higher you go on the Port Hills, the more wild it gets and the more undeveloped and less settled patterns. And so that comment I made was really just responding to that with regards to suddenly, you know, a residential dwelling appearing quite high up, you know, up around the Summit Road area would be potentially quite incongruous in that landscape. And so while I don't have a number in my head in terms of what an upper contour level might be, I just think it needs to be considered somewhere, and it needs to be able to be assessed through some sort of process. I mean, there might be some points where you can go a bit higher and some points where you can go a bit lower. That's why a contour line doesn't necessarily always work. And really that's as far as I got with that. It was just recognising that up quite high in the Port Hills is quite a wild, far more sort of natural landscape where buildings may not be as appropriate.
I think that consistency across, you know, across the two plans, looking at how we might be able to get that consistency in terms of what is an appropriate height, whether it is contour or, you know, You'd recommend, would you, that matters of discretion are the best ways to be able to deal with matters such as this? Or would you see another appropriate way of ensuring that linkage between the two plans to get that consistency on that side of the hill?
My response to that would be, as it's permitted to do dwelling in the ONFL on the Selwyn side, it would have to be a restriction, like a performance standard where you'd set a rule. So the Christchurch side of the line, it's restrict discretion in the first instance. So the matters of discretion straight away are the extent to which the defender would be interested in this application. Whereas due to the permitted status in the first instance, you need a rule that goes with that, setting a height from that point on. Yeah. So I'd recommend a rule if
Kia ora.
Thank you. Thanks for coming along, gentlemen. We've got no further questions. Thank you. Cheers. Right, Mr. Dr. Hume, please come forward. Federated Farmers of New Zealand, North Canterbury. Okay. Okay. Right. Right, and your submission's in relation to both 19 and 20, isn't it? It's to both chapters, so that's right, isn't it? Yes, and we've got your evidence here. Thank you very much for that. Take us through it as best you wish. You've got plenty of time if you need it.
No, well, I have nothing particularly that I want to say in addition to what we've already said. I guess as an overall statement, our aim is for farming activities to be able to function effectively alongside natural features within natural landscapes and within the coastal environment, recognising the special aspects of those areas.
and you've suggested, just looking at your statement, you've got, let's have a look here, you've got some tables at the end which suggest amendments, particular amendments to the rules and so forth.
Oh, the tables at the end.
Yep.
Are our submissions and further submissions.
Yep. Okay. Right. Well, while I look through those, I'll just see if the panel have any particular questions. Any questions, Yvette? Sorry, I missed you last time. Yeah. Do you have any questions?
Sure. And Kieran, thank you for your submission. I'm interested in the shelter belts, looking at the use of shelter belts. Within the provisions, there is an overview in terms of looking at the openness, the visual amenity of openness and the intrusion of shelter belts that might be there. I was interested in your paragraph 20 in terms of you put a totally different perspective on shelter belts in terms of how they are used for animal welfare. And so I too went looking within the animal welfare area in terms of care of animals and legislation that is around it. And that opened up a couple of more questions for me. So could you, I'm looking, what are the alternatives given what is the strong point of shelter belts? So what are the alternatives that we can have for animal welfare that farming practices might have, where it is just an open landscape? What are the alternatives that there might be for shelters? And in replacing a shelter belt and the consent to be able to do that, Indigenous species, because it's mainly exotic, so Indigenous species that would be used, how appropriate is Indigenous species to be able to be used as a shelter belt?
Yeah. When you started talking, I was actually going to suggest that shelter belts can take all sorts of shapes and forms. So any sort of blanket provision that makes life difficult for creating shelter belts is, yeah, probably not that useful, because you're probably aware that there is a bit of a move these days to move towards Indigenous species, and particularly where people have got centre pivot irrigators, that they want something that's a bit more low growing so they can drive the irrigator over the top of the shelter belt effectively. So Indigenous species do get used in that sort of context by some people, and I'm aware of a couple of farmers in mid-Canterbury that have done that quite effectively. But yeah, getting back to the need for shelter belts, it's difficult to think of alternatives to shelter belts because shelter is required. But as you quite rightly point out, macrocarpa trees and pine trees aren't the only option. In fact, underneath a macrocarpa hedge can be quite a cold, drafty place sometimes. So, yeah, depending on how they're trimmed and how old they are.
How often would a shelter belt be replaced? Sort of common occurrence. Yeah.
No, well, yeah, the honest answer is I don't really know. I guess it varies a lot. See some shelter belts around that have obviously been there for a while, whether, the big old pine trees or macrocarpa trees. Sometimes nature takes care of it by blowing them over. Yeah, it varies greatly. And other times too, shelter belts are trimmed regularly. You see macrocarpa type hedges trimmed neatly and tidily that don't grow to a gigantic state.
Hmm.
And at the other extreme, you see the reverse, trees that are just left untended for decades. So there's no easy answer to that question, I think.
Kia ora, thank you.
Okay. Malcolm, do you have any questions? Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your evidence, Mr. Hume. I've got 3 questions. The first one's really just a point of clarification. Just looking through your statement that you provided us, you tend to say Federated Farmers agrees, or Federated Farmers agrees, or Federated Farmers supports. Can we assume that when you say that, that's your professional view as well, if it's in your evidence? And it's you agree, you support, you state? Just want to clarify that.
Yes, generally speaking, that's true. Yep.
Thank you. Just want to clarify. So paragraph 12, you talk about Federated Farms continues to maintain the values and attributes contained can be safeguarded alongside normal adaptive farming practices. What are normal adaptive farming practices?
Yeah, that was a phrase that was used in our submission. Yes. And I guess my take on that is that farming needs, well, normal farming practices, that's a bit difficult to define too, but things that have traditionally been done, I guess. And the word adaptive comes in because farming's constantly changing. Farmers have been pretty good at changing in response to circumstances of various kinds, climatic, economic. Those are 2 very obvious ones where constant change is required. I guess farmers do need to be light on their feet to some extent. We're a trading nation and we're at the mercy to some extent of the demands of the rest of the world. We need to be able to respond to those. Climate dishes out all sorts of curveballs. Farmers need to be able to be flexible enough to survive those and hopefully thrive through them. And we've got the overlay, I guess, of climate change and the various constraints that's going to apply to us.
Okay. Right, so responding to economic changes or climate changes, or I guess regulatory sometimes as well.
Yeah, oh, very much so. Yeah. No, I missed that one.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I guess I'm just interested because the landscape study talks about vegetative change and the impact that could have on landscape values. And I guess, is vegetative change something that's a normal adaptive farming practice?
Well, in terms of being able to change crops, or change from pastoral farming to arable, or the other way around, arable to pastoral.
Right.
If that's what you mean by vegetative change, then that's constantly happening. It always has.
Yeah.
I don't see that as being destructive of the landscape, because landscapes change naturally over time anyway.
So we have heard from other witnesses that suggest that is destructive, or has an impact on rather than destructive necessarily.
Have they given particular examples where?
Well, I think the evidence of Ms. Lucas from this morning suggested that landscape and vegetation as well. Also, vegetation contributes significantly to landscape. Do you have a view on that?
Obviously, vegetation is part of a landscape, and if the vegetation is radically changed, then I guess you can argue that the landscape changes. Okay. But change isn't necessarily a bad or a good thing. Change is change.
Right.
I know it's not relevant to Selwyn, but there's a lot of debate about landscape issues in the Mackenzie Basin, for example, and I think people have some romantic idea that the original landscape there was golden tussock blowing in the wind, whereas I don't think that was the original landscape. It was a forest of some kind.
Sure, yeah, I appreciate that.
So something that we regard as being ideal may not have originally been there. And, I know there was a comment in the Section 42A reports about the Banks Peninsula landscape and the features of the current features of the landscape being able to be visible and be enjoyed is because of farming, essentially. The forest has been removed and the shape of the land has been revealed. I wouldn't argue whether that's good or bad, but the values that are now being protected are not the original natural values. They're values that have come with removal of the original, or much of the original vegetation.
Yeah.
And replacement by farming, essentially.
Yeah, thank you. So you said in paragraph 15 that Fair Farmers has no argument with protection of visual amenity values, but contends that this will be more effectively done by the general provisions that apply throughout the rural zones. So these are the VAL, the visual amenity values, I think that's what, visual amenity landscape. So just looking at the GRUS rules, the general rural zone rules, they seem to have a similar height limit to what's in the outstanding natural landscape provisions. But there is, I mean, one of the rules that's not there is the maximum reflectance rule at all. It's not in I didn't see it in the general rural zone provisions, but it is in the ONL, or natural features and landscapes provisions. Is that your view, that we don't need that rule either in a visual amenity landscape? That's not, is that what you're telling us?
Yeah, I'd need to think about that a bit more. I guess I'm personally a little bit concerned about telling people what colour they can paint their house, but yeah, I can see there are arguments in favour of doing that if someone, I guess sometimes someone can do something really outlandish, but which is a bit jarring in the landscape.
Sure.
But yeah, that's beyond my area of expertise. Really.
Okay, so that might be one rule that actually is applicable even in the visual amenity landscape. Okay, all right.
In the extreme, possibly.
Okay. And finally, this last question. Your paragraph 16, actually, the very next one. This is around permanently altering the profile, contour, or height of land. I guess, can you provide an example of where using rocks and boulders doesn't permanently alter the profile, contour, or height of land? I was just trying to come up with thinking about.
It depends where the rocks and boulders exactly are and how big they are, I guess.
Yeah. Is it more maintenance to maintain something that's existing? I mean, is that the intent of that?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Okay. So right. So you're using those to maintain for weathering or for natural hazards or something like that.
And from memory, what the stations were proposing was changes that didn't change the profile of the land. So in a way, their own favoured wording kind of takes care of any issue of changing the shape or contour of the land.
Maybe the confusion is because you sort of think when you're placing rocks and boulders that you are changing the profile, contour, or height. That's what you're doing, especially if they're really big rocks.
Well, if you're standing back, I guess looking at the landscape from a distance, shifting one or two rocks, even if they're quite big, you may notice if you were looking at the moment they're being shifted, but if you glance up immediately after, if you hadn't seen them being shifted, I would suggest they need to be a mighty big rock too.
Sure.
But there is a safeguard in that the favoured wording of the stations was that there wouldn't be a
yes, I understand.
Change the profile of the landscape.
No.
Some words like that.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Just got a couple of questions on the policy side of things. Yeah, so just in relation to your statement, paragraphs 9 to 12, policy 1, federated farmers expressed concern that policy 1 seeks to freeze landscapes in time within ONL areas and not allow working pastoral farms to be progressive or adaptive. And I'm just looking at the staff, the section 42A report recommends an amendment to J, that's policy 1J, which currently reads, recognising the existence of working pastoral farms and their contribution to the openness of outstanding natural features and landscapes, and providing for their ongoing operation and maintenance requirements. So there is an amendment suggested to, and it's not in response to Wharerotu Farmers submission, it's in response to DHL, CFSL and RIL. So other submitters have asked for that. And then in the relief that you've sought in that table for policy 1, let's get it up here. You've asked for quite a detailed addition, 4 subclauses A, B, C, and D. You haven't talked about that to us today. I'm just wondering, first of all, my question is, are you not satisfied with the change that's been made to J, which is to provide for farms' ongoing operation and maintenance requirements? It doesn't go far enough, I presume. That's your take on that, and you'd like us to put those 4 new clauses in. Did you want to elaborate on that or push that case a bit stronger with us today? So that's in your table on page 8.
Yep.
I should ask clarification. Are you asking that those 4 clauses replace all of policy 1?
Yeah, that was.
Is that I misread that. Okay. So you're actually suggesting it be shortened to only include 4 things. Okay. So
I think that was our original submission. I think the pragmatist in me was reasonably accepting of what was eventually proposed.
I suppose I could narrow the question down and say, have you got any comment on the change that the reporting officer has made to J, which currently talks about recognising the contribution pastoral farms make to the open landscape, I guess, outstanding landscape openness, and to provide for their ongoing operation and maintenance requirements. Is that a welcome addition in your view, those extra words?
Yes.
It is. Okay. Thanks. Did you want to say any more about that, or I'll ask you the next question?
Yeah, no.
Okay, all right. So policy 2, my colleague just asked you some questions about the VALs or visual amenity landscapes. You're suggesting that visual amenity is something that should be dealt with under the rural zones and not under this chapter. In my experience, the VALs are often included in chapters like this. You have the different categories of outstanding natural landscapes, and then you have the sort of slightly lesser category VALs. And have you had experience with other district plans that don't do that? That they just limit it to ONLs and then deal with visual things in the rural chapters?
No.
Yeah. Okay. All right. No, that's fine, because there are some changes suggested there too, which I'll just quickly look at. Yeah. Again, there's some quite deleting policy 2 and replacing it with, there's A to F, so there's some quite detailed matters there as well. All right. I think that's all the questions I have, actually. The other ones have been dealt with. All right. Now, look, I've got no further questions. Have I asked every panel member if they've got questions? I think I have. Sorry, it's getting a bit jaded from all the questioning, but no, thank you for coming along, and we understand it's very clearly set out what you're seeking, so thank you for coming along.
Thank you.
Very good. All right, now just before I conclude, I won't say close, but before we conclude proceedings, we've also got a statement of evidence tabled from ESI, or Ellesmere Sustainable Agriculture Incorporated, so we will read that as well as the other submissions that have been lodged by people who haven't turned up to the hearing. And Horticulture New Zealand, yes, as well. Thank you for that. Port NZ. This is for hearing 9, hearing 20. Hearing, I think there's only one for hearing 20 here, which is, anyway. But yeah, just like to reassure the farming, the sort of farming sector, the interests that you're promoting have also been covered in other submissions, including ESI, and we'll definitely read their statement and take on board those comments as well. So thank you.
I've read ESI's statement.
Yes, there's some cross references.
We're supportive of it.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that. And we've got no further questions of witnesses, so we'll conclude proceedings at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.